The needle was in my arm when my whole life fell apart. It was a Tuesday morning in September, and I had taken a half day from work specifically to donate blood. Not because I was noble or particularly charitable, just because the Red Cross van was parked outside the grocery store every month and I kept walking past it and feeling guilty. So I finally stopped walking past it. I signed in, answered the intake questions, rolled up my sleeve, and stared at the water-stained ceiling of that mobile unit while a tired technician labeled my vials one by one. I wasn't thinking about anything important. I was thinking about whether I had enough in my checking account to cover the electric bill. I was thinking about the transcription backlog sitting on my laptop at home. I was 29 years old. I made $14 an hour doing medical transcription from a studio apartment with a broken radiator, and my biggest concern that morning was whether the leftover pasta in my refrigerator had gone bad. Then the technician went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of someone doing their job. The specific, loaded quiet of someone who has just seen something on a screen that they are not sure how to handle. I heard her set down the vial. I heard the soft click of a keyboard. Then she cleared her throat and said, very carefully, that she needed to step outside for just one moment. She smiled at me when she said it, but her eyes didn't match her mouth at all. I sat there with a cotton ball taped to the inside of my elbow for 4 minutes. I counted. Then the door of the mobile unit opened again, and it wasn't the technician. It was a woman in a dark blazer with a federal badge clipped to her belt. She had close-cut gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she had been doing difficult things calmly for a very long time. She sat down in the chair across from me, folded her hands in her lap, and said, "Claire Weston?" I said yes. She said, "That's what we need to talk about." Her name was Agent Torres. She didn't put me in handcuffs. She didn't read me anything. She handed me a bottle of water from the small cooler in the corner and told me that my fingerprints, collected during the intake process as standard Red Cross protocol, had triggered an automatic match in the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database. She said the match was flagged as high confidence. She said the case had been open for 27 years. I said, "I'm not missing. I'm sitting right here." She said, "I know. That's why I'm here instead of sending a notification." She drove me to the regional FBI field office in a gray sedan that smelled like pine air freshener and old case files. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the city move past the window and tried to understand what my body was doing, which was shaking very slightly and very continuously in a way I couldn't make stop. Agent Torres talked to me the whole drive. Calmly, evenly, like someone reading a bedtime story to keep a child from panicking. She told me my name. My actual name. Emma Hartwell. She told me that Emma Hartwell had been 22 months old when she disappeared from a park in Carmel, California on a Sunday afternoon in October. She told me that Emma's parents, Diane and Robert Hartwell, had founded a biomedical technology company called Hartwell Precision Sciences in 1989, 2 years before Emma was taken. She told me that Diane had died in a single car accident 11 months after Emma disappeared, and that Robert had suffered a catastrophic stroke 3 years after that and had been in a memory care facility in Monterey ever since. His shares and estate managed by a court-appointed trustee. Then she paused, both hands on the wheel, and said, "The original trustee was your uncle." I turned and looked at her. Raymond. My uncle Raymond, who had told me my whole life that my parents died when I was 2 in a highway accident in Nevada. Who had raised me in his house in Phoenix with the specific, methodical coldness of a man performing an obligation he had never agreed to. Who had given me the smallest bedroom, the oldest laptop, the least of everything, and reminded me regularly in words so casual they hit harder than shouting, that he had given up a significant portion of his life and finances to keep me from ending up in state care. He has been the controlling trustee of Hartwell Precision Sciences for 23 years, Agent Torres said. The company went public in 2019. At current valuation, your share of the estate is approximately $62 million. I did not react the way people react in movies. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I sat very still in the passenger seat while the city moved past the window, and I felt something happen inside my chest that I had no word for yet. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was the specific sensation of a lock opening that you didn't know was locked. A pressure releasing that you had carried so long you had stopped knowing it was weight. Everything Raymond had ever said to me rearranged itself in my mind like a puzzle box snapping into a different configuration. He hadn't kept me out of resentment. He hadn't treated me like a burden because I was difficult or ungrateful or costing him money. He had treated me exactly the way a man treats something he needs to keep small and close and dependent. He had been grooming me the same way you train an animal. Reward quiet, punish curiosity, make sure it never gets comfortable enough to wander. Every time he told me I was lucky he hadn't sent me to foster care. He was reinforcing the bars of the cage. Every time he made me feel like a financial drain, he was making sure I would never look at the finances. He hadn't been raising a niece. He had been managing a liability. The FBI field office had a conference room with fluorescent lighting and a long table covered in folders. Agent Torres set a file in front of me and opened it slowly, like she was aware that what was inside would take time to absorb. There was an age progression photograph. The face in it looked back at me from the paper with my own eyes, my own mouth, but with a softness around the jaw that I had somewhere lost along the way. She looked rested. She looked loved. She looked like the version of me that had never been told she was a burden. There were photographs of my parents. My mother, Diane, laughing at a table somewhere sunny. My father, Robert, holding a baby that was me with an expression on his face that I had never seen directed at me in my entire life. There were documents, decades of documents, case files, corporate filings, trust statements, and at the bottom of the pile, a printed photograph of Raymond taken 6 months ago at a shareholder gala in San Francisco, standing in a tuxedo in front of a step-and-repeat banner with the Hartwell Precision Sciences logo behind him. He was smiling at the camera the way men smile when they believe they have won. "Your father is still alive," Agent Torres said quietly, watching my face. "He has significant memory impairment, but he is physically healthy. His care team has been notified, and your maternal grandmother is currently on a flight from Carmel. She has never stopped looking for you." I pressed my palm flat on the table to keep it from shaking. A grandmother. I had a grandmother. Raymond had told me all of my extended family had distanced themselves after my parents died, that he had tried to maintain relationships but people moved on. He had told me this so many times and so easily that I had believed it the way you believe something you've heard since childhood. You don't question it. It just becomes part of the shape of your world. I let myself breathe for the first time since the mobile unit. For the first time in my life, the ground under my feet felt like it might actually hold. That was when my phone rang. It was Raymond. I stared at the screen and then looked at Agent Torres. She tilted her head slightly. I answered. His voice was the same as always. That specific register he used when he was pretending to be relaxed, low and measured, with just enough warmth to sound like concern without actually containing any. He said he had heard I was at the FBI field office. He said he wanted me to know he wasn't angry, that he was sure this was all a misunderstanding, and that he was already on his way and had his attorney with him. I said, "How did you know I was here?" He said the Red Cross had called him as my emergency contact. I hung up. Agent Torres was already on her radio. They arrived 40 minutes later, and Raymond did not come in looking like a man who was worried about his niece. He came in the way he always entered rooms, with the specific self-possession of someone who has decided in advance that the space belongs to him. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and the man beside him, his attorney, carried a leather portfolio and the expression of someone who charged $700 an hour and was comfortable with that number. Raymond didn't look at Agent Torres. He looked straight at me. His eyes were the same as they had always been. Not cruel, exactly. Calculating. The eyes of a man perpetually running numbers. "Claire," he said, and his voice was warm, and I felt 23 years of conditioning try to respond to that warmth and had to consciously hold the floor. "Don't," I said. Just the one word. His attorney stepped forward and placed a document on the table in front of Agent Torres. He introduced himself and explained, in the smooth, unhurried way of someone who had rehearsed this, that his client had significant concerns about Claire's mental health going back several years. He said that Claire had a documented history of making unfounded accusations, that she had been treated for anxiety and depression, that she had severed contact with her guardian twice in the past and sent erratic messages during both periods. He said that in light of the current situation, and in light of the distress Claire was clearly experiencing, his client was requesting an emergency psychiatric evaluation and a temporary guardianship hold. He was trying to have me committed, not arrested, not charged with anything. Committed. Because a woman who has been involuntarily hospitalized for a psychiatric evaluation has significantly less credibility in a civil proceeding. Because a temporary guardianship hold, if granted by a judge, would put Raymond back in legal control of my decisions. Because he had spent 23 years learning exactly how to neutralize me, and this was his most efficient option. I looked at Raymond. He looked back at me with that expression I now understood completely. It was the expression of a man who had done this before. Not to me, specifically, but to situations. He had been neutralizing situations for 23 years, and he was very good at it. "The documentation your client has submitted," Agent Torres said, without looking up from the papers, lists 2 incidents of, quote, erratic communication. "Can you specify the dates?" Raymond's attorney said, "March of 2021 and November of 2023. Agent Torres turned to a different folder on the table. She slid 2 pages across to the attorney without comment. "In March of 2021, she said, Claire Weston was on a medical transcription contract with a hospital in Tucson. Her employer's timestamped login records show she was actively working from her home terminal from 6 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon on every day your client claims she sent harassing messages. The messages themselves were submitted as evidence in a previous civil dispute and were determined by a reviewing judge to constitute normal attempts to reach a family member." She tapped the second page. November 2023, same issue. She was at a certified continuing education course in Phoenix with 53 other attendees. The roster is notarized. Raymond's attorney glanced at the pages. Something shifted behind his eyes. Raymond said, "There are other incidents. There is also a 47-page forensic accounting report," Agent Torres said, "documenting wire transfers from the Hartwell Precision Sciences Trust account to a series of shell entities beginning in 2003 and continuing through last quarter. But we can discuss that separately." The room went very quiet. Raymond's face didn't change. That was the thing about Raymond. His face never changed the way other people's faces changed. He had spent his entire life performing composure, and he was extraordinarily good at it. But his hands, flat on the table, went very slightly white at the knuckles. His attorney leaned toward him and said something low and fast into his ear. Raymond pulled back from the table. He straightened his jacket. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the warmth entirely. What was underneath it was something I recognized from my childhood. The specific cold that came after the warmth failed. "Claire," he said, "I have taken care of you for your entire life. I want you to think carefully about what you are doing." And there it was. The same sentence, the same architecture, the same gravity he had always used to remind me what I owed him. I had heard that sentence in 100 different forms. "I know what I sacrificed for you. I could have walked away. I kept a roof over your head when no one else would have. I gave you everything. And for years I had felt the weight of it the way you feel the weight of a debt, constantly, in your chest, reshaping the way you stood and spoke and asked for things. But I knew now what the debt actually was. He hadn't taken care of me. He had kept me accessible. He had needed a living, breathing, dependent ward because a ward has no independent legal standing, because a ward doesn't get to review trust documents, because a ward who believes she is nothing doesn't hire attorneys or ask questions or walk into Red Cross donation vans on Tuesday mornings and accidentally match a federal database. He had needed me small. And for 27 years, I had been exactly the right size. "You didn't take care of me," I said. "You managed me." His jaw tightened. Just slightly. I kept going because I had 27 years of words backed up behind my teeth, and I was finally going to say them. "Every time you told me I was lucky you didn't let me go to foster care, you were making sure I'd never look up what I was actually owed. Every time you made me feel like I was expensive, like I was a problem you had generously decided to absorb, you were making sure I'd never ask where the money actually went. You needed me to believe I had nothing because if I ever understood what I had, it was over for you." I stood up from the table. "I'm not Claire Weston. My name is Emma Hartwell. And everything you've been living on for 23 years was mine." Raymond looked at me for a long moment. And then, with the practiced poise of a man who had survived many rooms, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the smile of a man laying down a card he had been holding in reserve. "You are correct," he said. "About most of it." He straightened his cufflinks. He looked at Agent Torres. He looked at his attorney, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I knew about the kidnapping," Raymond said. "I didn't arrange it. But I knew. And when Diane died and Robert became incapacitated, I stepped in as trustee because I knew where the child was, and I knew that if she ever surfaced, everything I had built with that trust over 20 years would disappear. So yes, I kept her close. I kept her quiet. I kept her small." His attorney had gone very still. "I'm telling you this," Raymond continued, "because it doesn't matter. The kidnapping occurred in 1996. Federal statute of limitations for civil claims arising from kidnapping is 10 years. The clock expired in 2006. You cannot touch me for any of it." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "The trust management is a civil matter, and I have documentation for every transfer. My attorneys have been very thorough. So," he straightened his lapels, "charge me with something, or we're done here." He turned toward the door. Agent Torres said, "Mr. Hartwell." Raymond turned back slowly. She had a different file now. Thicker than the others. She set it on the table and opened it to a tabbed section near the middle, and I could see from across the table that it was dense with financial documents, tables of figures, dates. "You're right about the kidnapping statute," she said. "You're right that it expired. But you've been serving as trustee of the Hartwell estate since 2001, which means you have been operating as a fiduciary." Raymond said nothing. "A trustee is a fiduciary," she said. "They hold assets not for themselves but on behalf of the beneficiary. And the statute of limitations for breach of fiduciary duty, specifically when the beneficiary was a minor and the trustee actively concealed the fraud, does not begin to run until the beneficiary discovers the breach. Not when the breach occurred. When they find out." She tapped the folder. "Emma found out approximately 4 hours ago." Raymond's attorney stood up. "Furthermore," Agent Torres continued, and her voice was still completely even, "the Hartwell Precision Sciences Trust holds the primary beneficial interest in a company that completed a public offering in 2019 with a valuation of $800 million. Every dividend, every capital gain, Every asset appreciation that has flowed through that trust and into your personal account since 2001 was obtained by a trustee who was actively concealing the existence of the living beneficiary. That is not a statute of limitations problem. That is constructive fraud. The remedy is disgorgement of all unjust enrichment, plus interest. She closed the folder. Your accounts are frozen as of this morning. Your residential property in Scottsdale is under a notice of levy. Your brokerage holdings have been placed under a federal preservation order. You don't own any of it, Raymond. You never did, you were just holding it for Emma. I watched his face. For the first time in my life, I watched the composure crack. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. Just a very small fracture, around the eyes that spread down into the jaw. He had built 23 years of his life on top of what he had stolen from me, and he had been so certain the law couldn't reach it. He had done the math. He had hired the attorneys. He had been methodical and patient and careful, and he had believed right up until this moment that the architecture of his theft was sound. That's my money, he said, and his voice came out wrong. Thin. Agent Torres said, no. It isn't. I built those assets. I managed those investments. The company would have dissolved without me. The company was founded by Robert and Diane Hartwell, she said. You were their business partner. When they were incapacitated, you leveraged that access to install yourself as sole controlling trustee and systematically transferred beneficial ownership to yourself over 2 decades. The forensic accounting is very detailed. She nodded at the door. The agent outside will walk you through the next steps. Raymond looked at his attorney. His attorney was looking at his phone. Raymond looked at me, and for the first time since I could remember, he looked like what he actually was. A man who had spent his entire life running from a lie, and had finally run out of room. You were nothing, he said, very quietly, in the specific tone he had used on me my entire childhood, the tone that was designed to land like fact. You were an inconvenience that wandered into my office in 2001 and I made something out of you. You should be grateful. I had heard that sentence so many times. As a child, I had believed it. As a teenager, I had hated it but still half believed it. As an adult, I had carried it like a stone in my chest. I had organized my entire emotional life around the work of not being the inconvenience he described. You kept me, I said. You didn't make me. You just hid me. There's a difference. The agents came in from the door. Raymond didn't fight. He wasn't a man who fought physically. He was a man who fought through paper and language and systems, and all of those systems had just been taken from him. He stood very straight while the handcuffs went on, and he kept his face arranged in something that was trying to be dignity, and I watched him walk out through the conference room door and into the hallway and out of my life. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Agent Torres sat down across from me and placed a simple piece of paper on the table. It was a signature line at the bottom of a document authorizing the transfer of the trust's controlling interest back to its rightful beneficiary. She set a pen next to it. I looked at the pen for a moment. I thought about the apartment with the broken radiator. I thought about $14 an hour and the electric bill and the leftover pasta and the specific tiredness of living a life that was always slightly too small, slightly too tight, like shoes that didn't quite fit. I thought about every time I had looked at Raymond across a dinner table and felt that particular shame of someone who believes they are consuming more than they deserve. None of it had been real. The smallness wasn't mine. It had been built around me, plank by plank, by a man who needed me not to know what I was. I picked up the pen. I signed. Agent Torres took the paper and said, quietly, that there was someone waiting in the lobby. She said the flight had landed 20 minutes ago. I followed her down the hall. Past the gray walls and the fluorescent lights and the bulletin boards with their laminated memos. Past the water cooler and the security desk and the heavy glass doors. Into the lobby. She was small. Older than I had expected. She had white hair pulled back and she was wearing a blue sweater that had a small pearl button missing from the collar, and she was standing in the center of the lobby with her hands clasped in front of her in the posture of someone who has been waiting for 27 years and is trying very hard not to fall apart in the last 30 seconds. She saw me and stopped breathing. I stopped walking. She said a name. Not Claire. The other name. The one I was still learning to hear as mine. And something happened in my body that I have no clean way to describe. It wasn't like a door opening. It was more structural than that. It was like the load-bearing wall of everything I had believed about myself simply ceased to exist, and instead of the ceiling falling, the sky came in. She crossed the lobby in 4 steps and put her arms around me, and she held on the way you hold something you thought was gone, with everything, with the accumulated weight of every morning you woke up and it still wasn't there. I stood in the lobby of the federal building and I let her hold me and I did not hold back and I did not say anything for a very long time because some things do not have language yet. Some things exist first as just the fact of them. The fact of being held. The fact of being found. The fact that 27 years ago someone had given me a name, and that name had been waiting for me the whole time, and now it fit. Later there would be things to deal with. Attorneys and accountants and depositions and the slow, strange work of learning a family history that had been kept from me for my entire life. There would be difficult visits to my father's memory care facility, and the specific grief of sitting with someone who cannot remember you no matter how much you need him to. There would be press coverage and legal proceedings and the strange dislocation of suddenly having resources after years of counting every dollar. There would be nights when I woke up at 3 in the morning and the old voice was still there, the one that sounded like Raymond, telling me I was lucky, telling me I should be grateful, telling me I was a burden. And I would have to sit up in the dark and remind myself, methodically, like practicing a new language, that the voice was a lie that had been installed in me by a man who needed me not to know my own worth. But Raymond was charged. Not just with breach of fiduciary duty. His attorneys had made a miscalculation in that conference room, and the spontaneous confession had given the federal prosecutors exactly the thread they needed to pull, knowingly concealing the existence of a missing child from the federal investigation, filing fraudulent tax returns that misrepresented the beneficial ownership of trust assets. Wire fraud across state lines. His bail was set at a number that required liquidating the Scottsdale house, which was already under levy anyway. His deputies, the ones who had executed the original paperwork installing him as trustee under false pretenses, were named in the civil suit. The attorney who had drafted the documents in 2001 was referred to the state bar. Raymond's personal financial advisor, who had processed 23 years of transfers while knowing the trust was in dispute, was cooperating with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced exposure agreement. The clock that Raymond had bet everything on, the one he had calculated so carefully, the one he had been certain had run out, had never started running, because you cannot begin counting time against someone who doesn't know they've been wronged. The law understood that, even when the people exploiting it didn't. $62 million meant nothing to me for the first months. I am not being falsely modest. It genuinely meant nothing in the way that a fact means nothing until you feel it. I understood it as a number. I could not feel it as a reality. What I could feel was my grandmother's house in Carmel, which smelled like cedar and sea salt and had a room that had been kept ready for me for 27 years. Not formally, not with a plaque or a shrine. Just kept. The bed made up. The window that looked out over the coast left slightly unlatched the way my mother had supposedly always kept it, because she had liked the sound of the wind. My grandmother told me about my mother in pieces, over weeks, the way you pass out something precious carefully. She told me she had been funny. Genuinely, structurally funny, the kind of person who made strangers laugh on planes. She told me she had been stubborn and that Robert had always said that the company's success was mostly Diane's stubbornness wearing down obstacles until they gave up. She told me that Diane had been 29 when she had me, and that the day I was born she had called my grandmother from the hospital and said, "Mom, I am absolutely terrified," and my grandmother had said, "That's how you know it's real." I was 29. I sat in the cedar and sea salt house, and I thought about my mother at 29 and I thought about myself at 29 and I thought about how close the numbers were and how much distance they contained. Raymond was convicted on 4 of the 7 counts. The fiduciary fraud counts alone carried sentencing guidelines that his attorneys spent months trying to negotiate down. They did not negotiate down enough. He received 11 years. He would be 68 when he was released. If he was released, he would have nothing to come home to. He had spent 23 years certain that the architecture of what he had built was impenetrable. He had been meticulous. He had been patient. He had been very, very careful to keep me small. He just forgot one thing. Small things grow. I still donate blood. Different van now, different city, different Tuesday mornings. The intake form asks the same questions. The needle feels the same. But when the technician labels the vials and types my name into the system, the name that comes up is the right one. The name that was waiting for me in a federal database for 27 years, while a man in a charcoal suit collected dividends and attended shareholder galas and reminded me, every time I got close to questioning anything, that I should be grateful just to exist. Emma Hartwell. It still sounds new. It probably will for a long time. Some things take a while to feel like yours. But I have learned that the feeling catches up. That the ground, once it finds you, tends to hold. That the lock you have been picking at your entire life, the one you couldn't name and couldn't see but could always feel, sometimes opens in the most ordinary of places. A van on a Tuesday. A needle in the arm. A technician who went very quiet. And a name, finally, that fit.